Hi, everyone. We're just going to give a couple seconds here for our attendees to roll in, and then we'll get started. Okay, so hi, everyone. I am Amy Montgomery. I'm the Managing Director at the Penn Institute for Urban Research. And I want to welcome everyone. This is our second of 3 lectures by Pablo Lazo, who's sharing his research on Mexico City. For those of you unfamiliar, the Penn Institute for Urban Research is a university-wide body that informs urban decision-making and public policy on issues of sustainable urban growth and development based on multidisciplinary research, instruction, and outreach. We love to support new, interesting, and interdisciplinary research on cities like today's talk by Pablo. So I'm just going to introduce Pablo, and then he'll join us with his presentation. Pablo Lazo is currently Director of Urban Development for the World Resources Institute. For more than a decade, he was the Deputy Director for the British Design Consulting and Engineering company, ARUP, where he led architecture and urban planning projects in various parts of the world. So please join me in welcoming Pablo.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and thank you, the Institute, for letting me be part of this exploration and research that I have been conducting over the last 3 years. I'm going to share my screen, and we will start straight away. Okay, this is the second lecture, as Amy mentioned, that I will be sharing with you this fall, this semester, and is going to be focusing on 2 of the metropolitan ecologies that I introduced on the previous lecture, where I set up the context of the research that I am conducting on 4 key ecological metropolitan elements of Mexico City that have shaped the form and the evolution of the city. And today I'm going to focus on 2 of them, the city water infrastructure and the eastern plains of the valley, because those are interconnected and they relate to each other. And I believe, and I would argue this on the research and the presentation, that in order for them to evolve in the future, they need to work closely together. So let me start quickly by refreshing what I presented on the first seminar. Just a few slides for those of you that did not attend the first lecture. I introduced 4 key ecologies for the metropolitan area of Mexico City, where I argue that a city like Mexico City of almost 42 square kilometers and over 500 years of history do require this constant revision of their urban evolution to guarantee the reinvention and regeneration in the future. And the last of these studies that it was conducted comprehensively dated from 1992, many years ago, and it was an academic publication by one very well-recognized institution in Mexico City. And since then, there hasn't been this kind of exploration that try to address how the city has evolved. And I argue at the time on the presentation that these new ways of understanding the city have to be different from those that were presented and published in that publication of over 40 years ago. That study did approach urban planning in an integrated way with a multidisciplinary approach, but there were things that at the time they were just starting to permeate the discourse of urban research. Things like urban sustainability, or like the systemic understanding of cities, and of course, urban ecology. And at the time on the presentation, I set the question of how to put these new questions on urban interpretations and urban understanding, and that the different approaches and perceptions of the city that we have, they could be either tragedy or comedy in terms of how you read these evolutions in cities. Like this painting of Pedro de Villegas, who very romantically was painting a beautiful landscape in the emerging city of Mexico back in the 16th century. And how you can idealize the city, make it look as it were, it will be very nice to live in. The evolution will be very positively for the health and quality of life on the inhabitants, or as it has been, a tragedy, because over and over, with the effect of climate change, you could see phenomena like flooding occurring more often and affecting a lot the people that live in cities. The other element that I presented at that initial seminar was how to understand the ecology and the urban ecology with a systemic approach. And that I presented that the origin of that concept is from John McHale, an engineer, a British engineer that wrote The Ecological Context in 1971, where he first started to understand the systems that were interrelated and interconnected to the activity of mankind, and how, if we were to try to improve these systems, to improve mankind, you need to understand that the systemic interconnections and interdependencies have to understand that you could have knock-on effects on other parts of this system, and therefore you need to balance out what you want to modify in a positive way, because there will be another kind of effect in another part of the system as well. So the question arising from this understanding of the ecological urban ecology is this question of how can we solve the impossibility of classifying these main systems of the city. And the research that I'm doing, and I have been working, propose to start learning what is most understandable in the local language and the language of design, architecture, and urban planning in Mexico City, which is infrastructure and its relationship with the urban pattern. So the second question for the research is what has generated the planning of infrastructure elements in the evolution of the city, in this case, Mexico City. And this obviously has a reference, a theoretical reference to the political of nature of the French philosopher Bruno Latour, where this systemic approach opens the possibility to unify elements in the universe that is shared in the urban context, as opposed to this binary reading, very modernist. So if we can review and revise these elements of infrastructure and their implications to the evolution of the city, I would argue that one could realize that it has never been produced a city like Mexico City with such a mixture of a diverse geographical elements and economic activities, but with huge infrastructural projects that are so anti-intuitive and with a very strong push for creating housing for the population, with such an exacerbated centrality in the city itself, and that it is also possible that there is no new city that will have this such factors combining for their urban evolution with their own mistakes, as Mexico City has. And this is where I want to start presenting these two ecologies. The first one got to do with the wastewater infrastructure that is very common to many other cities in the world. And I want to start setting up the context of what is wastewater infrastructure. And for this, I just wanted to go back a couple of thousand years here and really to reflect that living this near water has been with human civilization since the beginning of time. It has been a desire and a necessity at the same time. From information we have from the ancient cities or human settlements, permanent human settlements, those indicated that they were established in the proximities of a certain type of water body, a river, a lake, a coast in the sea. Babylonia, from Herodotus, accordingly to this Greek historian, was founded between the two rivers that are now in the country of Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates. But it was founded there because the soil quality was a fantastic combination of soil sediments and soil and water sources very close to, very, very apt for agriculture. And if we move quickly over a couple of thousand years, the Netherlands are the best example probably of how human civilization, of human society can live with water. From the early 13th centuries, this region of Northern Europe, which the whole territory, it is probably embedded in one of the biggest river networks, connected to three big rivers in Northern Europe, the Rhine, the Meuse, and the Scheldt, have practically all their territory below the sea water level and have suffered many floodings and losses of land throughout their history. And because of that, they learned from very early how they need to create a model to manage in an integral way, how to manage the water circulation as part of their way of living. The famous water bodies created in the 13th centuries were created by different regions in the Netherlands to being responsible and coordinating all the infrastructure work related to water drainage, water retention, but also water distribution, which is the reflection of the image that you see on the screen, which is the urban and landscape of the whole country. This Dutch approach could be understood as an acceptance of the role of human society could have in a symbiotic way with the natural environment, and not to try to disrupt the way the natural environment operates. I use these two terms as John McHale used it in his book, and they're very extremely related to the case of Mexico City and the future of Mexico City, where the key is this symbiotic relationship with water. The images that you have here is three different types of symbiotic relationship that the Dutch have developed throughout the years, where you have very natural environments where water bodies and agricultural land is just converging and operating for both sides in a positive way, to a more structural landscape in the lower image on the left. And finally, urban context in Amsterdam, where you do have urban systems as we know them, houses, buildings, roads, bridges, trees, but are working and are operating with the water systems as well. So at the beginning, in the Central Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City was founded, we had a series of combination of lakes that were interconnected, with a small island in the middle called Tenochtitlan, where the Aztec found in 1520 the capital of the Aztec Empire. And the lakes were divided by only a single infrastructure element, which was that straight line between the Lago de Texcoco and the left lakes, because the left lakes had sweet waters coming from the rivers, from the mountains on the left of the image, and the salty lakes, which was on the right of the image, that were seasonal lakes that would have water on the rainy season and will dry up a little bit on the dry season. And towards the south, because the soil quality was a little bit better, they created this system of chinampas, which, if you have come to Mexico City, it's the famous area called Xochimilco, where you can see this agricultural system on small floating islands around the lake. And what this demonstrated was that the Aztecs understood that they need to have this symbiotic relationship with the water systems of the lake, and that the connections to the firm lands on the edges of the lake were only minimal elements of connectivity. You could see them in the image. 4 key routes to the south, to the west, and to the north. And basically, they operate like this for over 200 years. But what happened was that after the Spaniards came in, and this is just a snapshot, this is the new system. So in 1550 with the Aztecs, you had the island in the middle, you have the dike that divided the salty from the sweetwater lakes, and that was it. Those were the only elements that affected the water bodies in the valley. In the second millennia, 15 years ago, the system was like this. There was no water lakes. All the water was drained on tubes and tunnels beneath the city. And that is affecting the condition of the soil of the city, but also it's affecting the ground condition and ground stabilization of the city, because the valley is sinking in different kind of ways across the city. And what that has really created is the gravity to leave the water out to the north of the valley, as it was with the Aztecs. It has now changed, and it has pushed the city to build new and deeper tunnels for discharge water. So what has happened, in a very synthetic way, in over a little bit more of 3 centuries, this process of drying up lakes in the valleys and setting up this drainage system has created more flooding problems for the city, but has also created 2 systems that are somehow trying to be interconnected with these interdependencies, but that they're very minimal in terms of the space that required to operate as they were operating 3 centuries ago. So this diagram, you have the system of discharge, which are these tunnels discharging all the wastewater out of Mexico City to the north. And also you have certain elements within the system, within the city, that collect water, particularly rainwater in the rainy season, accumulate it, and then just discharge it. And this is completely different from the original system that the Aztec had. This is not a symbiotic system at all. So where the whole discrepancy started, where the whole deviation of that great model that the Aztec had started to deviate to the system that we have now. Well, around 1855, the city in this map that you see here was growing and was growing at a very fast pace. And the drying lakes on the eastern side of the valley, when there was no rain, the edges of the lake recede, and therefore the agricultural land started to become more available. And we will see that in the other ecology, how that has affected in particularly the eastern side of the valley. But that opened up a whole area for urban development. And at the time, there was a huge debate whether to retain these water elements, the lakes, and to create a system that would connect them in the eastern edges of these lakes with a system of navigation that could connect the lakes on the north to the lakes on the south of the valley, so that you could see all these villages would have been interconnected by a canal system that could act as a retainer for the water on the rainy season when the lakes would grow, and then on the dry season when the lakes recede, this canal would operate independently. This was a competition. The competition did not succeed in getting the key elements, which were really three: the canal that I mentioned on the eastern side, and then retaining the two big lakes in the eastern, the Texcoco Lake and the Laguna of San Cristobal a little bit on the north, with the Xochimilco on the south of the valley. A series of political driven decisions, such as freeing up land in the east of the city, to allow the plan not to go forward, and therefore have a different plan in place. So the city, which you could see here in black, could grow and continue to grow to the eastern, and only manage to have two main elements to be built around 1940 of the original plan. Two big canals, one called River Cuautitlan and the other one called Gran Canal, that would discharge the water to the lakes on the north. And the evolution of the city, what you could see in the next slide, is in 2019, the gray, you see the urban expansion or urban footprint of Mexico City as it is right now. And if the model that was proposed in 1950 would have gone ahead, you could see that we could have still had certain pieces of the lakes, but also this canal connecting and acting as a resilient water infrastructure to avoid flooding on the eastern side. But in contrary, or in opposition, what has happened is this type of water drainage system. The red lines indicate the main water treatment sewage lines going to the north, and then these small pockets of water body that try to solve the flooding problems of Mexico City when in the rainy season, and actually does not work at all. And it's a system that is in continuous pressure of revamping and regeneration. So this is the difference between what could have worked in 1856 and what it is actually the reality in the city. A system that is not resilient, a system that requires continuous improvements and continuous upgrades on the gray infrastructure, and is not solving the problem. But in reality, there are parts of the valley that still have the symbiotic relationship, particularly in the south of Mexico, on the valley near Xochimilco. When on the rainy season, you do have these interactions between the urban environment and the urban footprints and urban activities and the water elements. And I want to close this ecology with three reflections. One reflection is about, if we take this ecology at a metropolitan level, we could propose to reestablish this canal to the eastern of the valley that could reconnect not on its whole length, but partially the lakes on the north with the water bodies that are created artificially to retain water in the central part of the city, and then still connected through a series of nature-based solution infrastructure to the south in Xochimilco. And that will provide water resiliency to the Valley of Mexico City. And if we want to really push this ecology ahead and forward, the city could have the opportunity to bring back the activities that occur with the water channels and the water and the lakes in the ancient Aztec Empire, and bringing canals into the city back again, so that you could really move with this other infrastructure throughout the city with a similar geometry and course as the previous one on the eastern side of the city. And that could then really take the narrative of this ecology to the final level, which is to create this water resilient metropolitan plan, which we have been discussing, and I've been presenting this to different authorities in Mexico City, and they're still dubious about the level of investment, but they are attracted because it does provide this more resilient model for the communities on the eastern side of the valley, when there is a lot of rain and they have a lot of problems with flooding and overrun of drainage in this part of the city. And this is where it connects to the second ecology that I want to present today, which is the plains in the east, what I coined the term volcanoburbia, because it's a community that lives in between the central part of Mexico City and in the faces of the huge topographical mountain ridge of the two volcanoes that face the city, the Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. And this huge area that is now being annexed to the city urban fabric had this origin, an origin about a very romantic and nostalgic perception of the valley overseeing the volcanoes. And this image that was painted many, many times, and it was famously recorded also by photographers in the 19th century, it was showing this amazing natural landscape of the Valley of Mexico City towards the mountains. But the reality 120 years later, with the urban growth and the urban pressure to create housing for many, many people that came to work in Mexico City, particularly between 1950 and 1960, is this. This is the valley, and the mountains are at the back end. A huge, huge area that is home for over 2 million people that daily commute approximately 500,000 trips to Mexico City to work, and where water supply, it's only covering 70% of the population. If you see this area on the map, and it's here in the screen, you have the areas, they're a little bit pixelated, of these huge areas of human settlements that were the 5 first original pre-Hispanic villages that slowly were annexed to Mexico City. And the lakes and the original lake footprints, you can see it here. So you could see that most of these now urban settlements are on lake beds, are on what was used to be ancient lakes. And if we take a little bit more analysis of how this evolution of the plains have taken shape, it's very, very peculiar, but it comes down basically to two main elements. The first one is the connectivity element. So at the time that key infrastructure was built in Mexico City, and for this I'm talking about what is called periférico, which is a ring road that more or less goes around what is the administrative edge of Mexico City, and the road, the motorway or the highway that takes you from Mexico City to the city of Puebla on the other side of the volcanoes. And this road, that it's a highway, very important, that takes the city to the town of Texcoco, what it was used to be the outskirts of Mexico City. And this created that this whole area around the dotted lines, the red dotted lines that were used to be lakes, became available for urban development. And the only other phenomenon that created these huge plains for development was this, a flat, very suitable land for human settlements that could be adapted for agricultural use, but that was politically decided not to promote agriculture, but it was rather the opposite, to drain the lake bed, try to impose certain agricultural activities, but with the soil that had extremely salty conditions, they turn it around and open up this land for huge, huge urban development and creation of social housing. What happened was that a lot of new developments started to arise for social housing in the early 70s. With this idea of progress and creating a city that was going to be built in the periphery of the Mexico City area, with conditions more associated with rural landscape, but the results were completely the opposites. And this is where it starts to become important and relevant, this ecology of the Eastern Plains. One of the recent studies that I did with the research was to try to map out, for example, the tree coverage. And you could see there on the image, this is from NASA taken last year, the tree coverage around Mexico City Central Valley, with the original lakes indicated in the image. And you could see that there is a very fine, if you look carefully on the image, you could see that there is a very clear division between the tree coverage on the western part of the city that has higher economic, socioeconomic input population, but also it's closer to the hills on the west. And the eastern side of the valley, which is this huge plain, the ex-lake beds, where there is very little or less amount of green coverage. The calculation from the data set is 4:1. So you have 16% more tree coverage on the west side of Mexico City that's on the east side of Mexico City. So one of the key elements for the Eastern Plains is you need to increase the green surface coverage if you want to shape a different type of urban environment for the future in this part of the city. And let's look in detail to one section of these Eastern Plains. And it's the same image that I reflected upon to the previous ecology of the wastewater infrastructure near Xochimilco. This area, take a look. It's an image on the upper left-hand side, is taken from the volcano Parque Xicotencatl. On the dry season, it's very dry, but there are certain water bodies there. You have the urban footprint of the surrounding neighborhoods and communities. When there is rainy season, the agricultural activity creates a new landscape, the image on the right-hand side. And this is interesting because this area in particular has much higher tree coverage than the rest of the Eastern Plain, has 12% of tree coverage. But also important is the symbiotic relationship that I was talking about, because it has 17% of the area covered by water bodies, lake marshes, and chinampas on a rainy season. So it is possible to create a new type of urban development policy and strategy that connects water elements on one side and tree coverage on the other side to create something different that is non-existent at the moment in the Eastern Plains. And this brings me to the final one, the final element that needs to be shaped into policy and urban development on the Eastern Plains, which is more water bodies. And at the moment, you could see there in the image, again, I left the red dotted line to show you the same division that I applied to the green coverage. And this is from the study of a water sensitive study that was done by the Dutch government in 2015 that indicates the area prone to flooding in the city is the Eastern Plains. So that is where you need more water infrastructure, but not only water bodies to retain water when there is a lot of rain, but also a new water infrastructure supply to increase the availability of water, of potable water. Because one thing that COVID left us as a revelation is, and this image, the red areas in Mexico City in this diagram is where there were the highest number of COVID diseases in Mexico City Valley. And it's exactly the same in the Eastern Plains, where you have less water supply availability, but at the same time, you have more risk of flooding. So it's the COVID effect that has also made a final proof that you really need also to bring to this part of Mexico City, the Eastern Plains, a new type of water infrastructure, a type that increases the water supply, but also reduce the risk of flooding. And this is how it looks like at the moment, the Eastern Plains. And this is the image from the photograph Ahmed Markel that I showed in the first seminar that shows why this vastness of the Eastern Plains cannot continue to evolve in the future like this. And these are the two comparative analyses that I have made of the research. On the left, you have what the government has done in terms of policy and policy and investments. And in the right is what the research of this ecology has shown that needs to happen and needs to change. So instead of investment on only water supply and water reuse still remains low, you really need to invest in water reuse measures and green infrastructure. You also really need to reduce the commuting trip time that takes from people traveling in and from this part to Mexico City. And also, finally, it is important to understand that there is no necessity to really change the shape and the character of the architecture of this part of Mexico City. It is more to work with what is already there, but really understand that if you don't resolve the problem of water scarcity, you're not going to resolve the problem also of public health for this population, that it's important. And I want to stop there. Thank you very much. And I'm open for questions and comments you may have. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I just want to encourage you to drop your questions in the Q&A if you have any. We'll wait a minute here. Maybe while we give people a second to ponder their questions, we could just give everybody a little information on, there's a third event that we'll be hosting with Pablo to round out this series. It's on just Tuesday, December 6th at noon, and you can register for it on the Penn IUR website. But Pablo, do you want to give us just a little preview into what participants will gain in the third and final session?
Sure, Amy. And then I saw a few questions there. The other two ecologies that I will present in the third and final seminar are two ecologies that are more related to the built environment or the architecture of the Mexico City. So one is the third ecology called multifamiliaridad, which is the adjective for the modernist social housing projects that shape many areas of Mexico City. And you will see how and why these projects, large-scale urban projects, have shaped substantially not only the territory and the physical form of the city, but also the way to inhabit those areas and those parts of Mexico City. And the other final ecologies is got to do with this interconnection of the villages that were part of the original ecosystem of economic activities and political arrangements that the Aztec had, and then they were transposed to the Spaniards, and that created a new footprint of tramways and connecting transport system that also shaped Mexico City as we see it, as we know it nowadays. So those are the two ecologies that I'll present in the final seminar.
Great, and now we have a few questions, so I'll turn it over to you to answer those.
Thank you. So the first one I see here from Alex, would more water bodies result in the displacement of people? True, yes, true and false, Alex. There is a space in the eastern plains of the city that have remained empty, specifically because of when there is rain and rainy season, they get water, and you get some sort of marsh or low water level, but nevertheless water bodies there. So there are areas, substantial areas, that could be then restored and increase their capacity by making certain level changes, but you could create these water bodies to accommodate this water system that I show on the last slide. And really the other thing that is important is that, I mean, I show it very quickly, but the research has shown that there are very small areas where you really need to negotiate with people already living or being settlements that could be or would need to be relocated to create this water canal on the eastern side. Second question, Steve, water right laws, do they exist in Mexico? It does exist one general law, which is in the Constitution, and it's only a law that gives the rights to get access to water supply, but nothing more. And that is part of the bigger problem, which is how you manage and operate utility companies in not only Mexico City, but in many other cities around Mexico. So that also, it's a huge barrier, Steve, nowadays to solve and come with the innovative modes of investment and new type of infrastructure, because that requires investment, new financial models. And at the moment, the law that it's currently valid in Mexico does not allow for private sector and for many other modes of financing to coming into the water markets, unfortunately. can Mexico City address the water problems without relocating lots of people? Unfortunately, the answer is no. You would need to relocate some population. According to the survey we did in 2 communities in the eastern plains, Ecatepec in the north and Chalco in the south, is roughly 25 to 35,000 people that would need to be relocated within the same local neighborhoods. But in order to make these more resilient on the eastern plains, you would need to have that relocation in place. And it's the image that I show at the beginning of the tragedy, where is these people that suffer this flooding recurrently on a yearly basis, and it is a matter of whether if they were making the decision, they may want to be relocated if they have a good offer to relocate it. But at the moment, that is part of the problem, that there is no policies for relocation with a water infrastructure project knit together. Hypothetically, where would funding come from this infrastructure implementation? Would it be more likely to be a public or private sector initiative? Well, I already hinted before, but it will require a sort of joint effort between public and private sector because of 2 reasons. First is that water infrastructure in Mexico and the water utility companies generally subsidize the cost of water supply and wastewater collection. And that is because in a country like Mexico, if you increase the cost of water, you really affect directly a huge amount of population. And therefore, if the public sector cannot invest more, you really need to bring the private sector with a different type of benefits and a different type of funding model to participate in this revamp of infrastructure. And it has happened in other cities in Mexico, smaller cities. And in Mexico City itself, it's started to happen, I would say, in the last 5 years, with a joint effort between the private sector, particularly the industrial companies, and also the utility companies of not only the Mexico City, but the other states surrounding the valley that have to come together to make different type of funding available. But yes, it will need to be public and private coming together.
I think there's one more question there. Do you see that one, Pablo, the last by Miguel?
Yes. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You told us that it's actually possible bringing back some activities related with water. Which ones are you think about? What types of new water economies are possible in Mexico? Well, Miguel, the first one that is very viable is all the flower and agriculture that occurs in Mexico, in the southern part of Mexico City, in Xochimilco and Tláhuac, and it still has huge economic, creates a huge economic market in Mexico City. And at the moment, what happens is that everything travels from the south to the central markets in Mexico City by roads. So they get cultivated in this part of Mexico City in the valley, and then they get transported and sell in markets in the north. And if you connect with one canal that used to exist, the Canal de la Villa, until 1960, that runs from the south of Mexico City to the almost, if you have been to Mexico City, near a viaducto, which is one of the main roadways east to west of the city, you could transport and move a lot of these agricultural products and this canal, and then take out a lot of cars and a lot of trucks that create congestions going to the north and to the central part of the city. And then the other important element of this water economy is the water reuse. At the moment, the water bodies that I show on the images on the eastern plains are pretty much retention water bodies for overflow of the wastewater discharge system. When there is a lot of rain, that the tunnels cannot cope and the canals cannot cope to discharge to the north, they are relocated and discharged to these water bodies, and they are left there without proper reuse. And I think with an investment, and this is part of the plan of the water resilience plan that I show on the research, if you build the infrastructure to reuse that water for irrigation, for non-potable use in other economic activities, you have a lot of water for good 4 to 6 months of the year to be used rather than to be left there to evaporate quickly as it has happened recently. And the city is thinking about that, but unfortunately it does require, and that connects to the other question previously, it does require investment plans that do not only focus on water supply, but focus on water reuse, which is an agenda that's still slowly coming in the political discourse in Mexico City.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for the presentation and answering the questions. And for everyone who's with us today, we did drop in the chat the link to register for the third event, which again is on December 6th at noon, and hope you all can join us to continue this learning and conversation. Thank you, Pablo. And we'll be making this video available to publicly on our website, so anyone can watch it after the fact. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Amy, again for the invitation, and thanks so much for the space and sharing this research.
Have a great day, everyone.